Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Justin Dombrowski, author of Murder and Mayhem in Erie, PA.
Justin Dombrowski is the author of Murder and Mayhem in Erie, Pennsylvania. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wanted to write this book for several different reasons. One is being a true crime fan, I would say myself. I majored in criminal justice at Mercyhurst University here in Erie, Pennsylvania. The plan was originally to go into law enforcement. Ultimately, I did not do that, but I would say the desire to be interested in many different cases, from a historical nature and as well as local history kind of persisted. When I wrote this book, really what kind of, I would say, preceded it was the fact that there, at least at the time, there were not really any major books that really delved into Erie's history in regards to any kind of older cases or more infamous cases. Living here in Erie, of course, there is the usual, I would say, collection of infamous cases, darker cases that, a lot of people will dredge up and remember from time to time. And it really kind of showed the impact that these crimes had on the local community. And what piqued my curiosity is what was, I would say, about the cases that we don't know, the older ones that have been kind of lost to time. So that kind of facilitated an interest in wanting to write something that today's, local historians and individuals who, are fascinated by local history would find surprising and something that would provide a new twist, I would say, on that area of local history.
Now, you mentioned your interest in maybe getting into law enforcement when you were in school, and that you did do an internship with the Erie County Detective Unit. What was that experience like for you?
That experience itself was very rewarding. I remember when it came time to do the internship that, there's many different options. And that was when it really stood out, just because, at least from the description, from what I recall of it, it was not your normal run-of-the-mill internship. Like, there was some individuals I was classmates with who did internship with the Erie City Police. And I decided to go a different route and work with them. That really provided a eye-opening experience to be able to work with many different detectives, at least from the county level, dealing with anything from assisting local jurisdictions, being able to get a real hands-on experience from dealing with prosecutors and the way the whole system worked. It was really rewarding, I would say, at the time, because Brad Folk was the Erie County District Attorney here. And that was actually not too long before he had passed away. But at that time, Brad Folk, I would say, had a quality about him where he was able to get a lot of Erie's older unsolved cases back into the public eye. He had quite success with being able to try some of those. And Brad was really an advocate for victims, and that really kind of stood out. And it really created an atmosphere that going forward, especially with writing this book, I would say helped me kind of craft it in a way to where, it gave that emphasis on, remembering victims and those who were essentially impacted by the crimes. Over and all, even though the internship was only a few months, it was a very rewarding experience. I got to see a side of law enforcement that not a lot of people were able to be, exposed to. And it's something that, I'm very grateful for.
Why did you pick these particular stories to include in the book?
Well, in regards to the book, originally when the idea was presented to the History Press, the plan was originally to go in, I believe, with over 20 different stories. Obviously, with the constraints with publishing and word counts and so forth, I was not necessarily able to really focus on all 20 of those. So those eventually, what we did, working with my managing editor and myself, we kind of went through the different cases, picked out which ones would be, I would say, not necessarily the most sensationalist, but really ones that really stuck out. And that included, there was a purported train robbery that had occurred here. There was an explosion that occurred at the Pennsylvania Railroad ore dock right by the bayfront here. Several of Erie's older unsolved murders, including that of the first police officer killed in the line of duty for the Erie City Police Department. So they really were kind of handpicked, really to kind of give a balance, I would say, between what me and my editor deemed murder and mayhem. So that way it kind of provided, I would say, a consistent different flow so that you weren't reading the same story more than once. You were getting something different with each chapter. So going from 20, we went down to about 10 or 15, and then that was gradually reduced to about 6, which was within the parameters of what the publisher had set up. And that was essentially how we arrived at those 6 cases.
Now, one of the figures that appears in several of the stories is Erie County Detective Frank Watson. He seems to have been a bit of a character. What did you find out about him?
Frank Watson was really, at the time, both loved and hated by local newspapers in Erie. From doing the research on him, Watson was a diligent investigator who knew what he was doing. Prior to being a county detective, of course, he had worked with the railroad, and he had quite a bit of experience, I would say, with that. Just being able to see how he functioned, I mean, he was noted as being shrewd, but yet reasonable in some aspects. And what really kind of stood out with him, I would say, as one of the central characters that you see in some of these chapters is, for example, the way he investigated the murder of Detective Sergeant James Higgins from the Erie City Police Department compared to how he then handled the unsolved murder of Manley Keene in 1909, which occurred 4 years after Higgins was murdered. It was really a interesting, I would say, perspective to see two different sides of how he was viewed by the press. You can make, I would say, you can make similar comparisons to law enforcement today. We see it all the time with cases and investigations where, if answers are not provided to the public in a timely manner, that can sometimes, put, I would say, investigators on the spot as to, what they're doing, what the public feels they're not doing with an investigation. And that was really interesting to see from that perspective with those two cases. But he really, all the way up until he died in the 1920s, he was involved in some of Erie's more older infamous cases. And like I said, the public, especially the newspapers here, had a love-hate relationship with him. When he did a good job, they praised him. When the press felt that he wasn't doing his good job, they certainly lambasted him at every opportunity they could.
Now, we live in a post-CSI world where we kind of expect really intricate and complicated skills by investigators, but some of the stories in here, it seemed like that they really was an earlier, more primitive period in terms of investigative techniques and technology.
Right. Well, at the time, it was certainly fascinating because in early 1900s, Erie, for the most part with their police department, they were pretty progressive. I mean, I think it was around 1903, they had actually hired their first African-American officer to the force. But there were certain angles, and this is very evident with some of the investigations where, as progressive as Erie's police department was, there was also some angles that they were rather behind on. By 1909, most police departments had invested in a Bertillon department with fingerprints and so forth. Erie at that time did not have that. They were kind of, I would say, behind the 8 ball on that. And, the fascinating perspective is I usually tell this to individuals when I talk about these types of crimes, is that had almost every single one of these crimes occurred today, they probably would have been solved with the advent of, like you said, technology. I think in a sense we've become so used to being around forensic evidence such as DNA, and we have so much that definitely benefits our law enforcement community today with being able to solve crimes and hopefully achieve justice, that we kind of forget that there is a time where police had to basically go off of as much circumstantial evidence as possible. And I think that definitely provides a very interesting window to the past for that.
Now, one of the stories you tell is of train number 41 of the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad in 1911. There was a robbery. What happened?
So what happened with that is, as the train was making its way to Erie, it was on the outskirts of the city in an area of what today is known as Wintergreen Gorge. Pretty much what happens is there's a curve above the gorge, which is what is still known as 5 Mile Curve. As the train came around the curve, there was essentially an obstruction in its path, and the engineer had essentially slowed the train down, managed to actually come in contact with the obstruction that was actually, set up with some red lanterns to get their attention. The train was then boarded by several masked bandits who were armed. And without really giving too much away, because this was one of those situations that when you really read the newspapers from the time, it really kind of brings a sense of a story that you would read out of the Wild West, here on, the, eastern seaboard of the United States, which was really unheard of. And there was so much detail that was able to be obtained from everybody who was involved. But ultimately what happened is that there was a shootout aboard the train. The bandits did escape. But the investigation into who was responsible was really remarkable at the time. And, including all the different agencies that were involved, eventually located several individuals who were responsible and brought them to justice. But the real amazing part of that story is that, and this is something that I found out while doing the book, is I have a very good friend who used to be with the Erie City Police Department. And his wife, her grandmother, was a orphan and was in a local orphanage here. And there was a rumor that I believe it would have been her great-grandfather, was a criminal of sorts, and he went by the last name Winnecke. Well, ultimately, as fate would have it, in rather unusual circumstances, one of the individuals that was eventually arrested and convicted for this attempted train robbery turned out to be her great-grandfather. And, we were able to provide additional research in that not only made that connection, but it really kind of brought a unique perspective to show how, even though some of these crimes occurred over 100 years ago, the impact that they still have on families today. Sometimes you'll have a positive impact. Sometimes other families, will certainly not talk about, some of these stories that have happened even after 100 years because of the impact it's had. But all in all, that was definitely a case that when it occurred in 1911 was during a year where Erie was really kind of thrust into the national spotlight. For example, in February of that year, you had the desecration of the mausoleum here at the Erie Cemetery, which was then followed up with black hand letters that were sent to Charles Strong, and that brought in the several different private investigating groups. You had the Pinkertons involved. You had the Burns Agency, and there were several murders that had occurred in 1911, which also had really all the focus for that time being was on Erie. So I would say that was really an important case because at the time it was sensational. It made the news throughout the whole country essentially.
Now, this particular case with the robbery, I thought was interesting because there were so many different law enforcement entities involved here. You had Erie Police, the Pennsylvania State Police was involved. Because the mail car was robbed, the Postal Department had its investigators there. And then there were railroad detectives. So some of the different railroad companies had detectives. Were you surprised to find that many law enforcement entities involved in this?
I was surprised to some extent because back then it was also a time where you would see other cases which appear in the book where agencies did not necessarily cooperate or share information. But from the federal aspect, it wasn't really too surprising, mostly because before you had the Federal Bureau of Information, actually probably one of the more premier departments that would have actually operated during the time were postal inspectors. They had pretty much a wide range to investigate. And this case was no different, especially, since, like you said, the United States mail was attempted to be robbed at that time. But it really kind of showed, depending on the type of cases even back then, which ones you would more than likely have cooperation from authorities on. And then, for example, with the attempted train robbery, you had numerous individuals, and it was so crowded. You had, like, I think, it reads kind of as mayhem in a sense, because everybody's stepping on each other's toes, and doing all that. But it really kind of was something that again, it's one of the more fascinating parts of doing the book, because it was really interesting to see how things worked back then. But you can also make that perspective that we still see some law enforcement agencies work together today in the same way.
How did you do your research? Did you have access to some of the original case files?
So in regards to some of the research, any cases that occurred before 1950 no longer exist. Those files are long gone or destroyed or disappeared. And I did have excellent cooperation from the Erie City Police Department. They were very open to answering all my questions and being able to look into stuff that had occurred so long ago. And beyond that, the only other really avenues is there was newspaper articles from the Erie Daily Times primarily, and you also had the Dispatch Herald. Erie County Historical Society does have a collection of criminal records, which were loaned from the Erie County Courthouse. However, those are really only your cases that are going to go to trial. If you're handling unsolved cases or cases that did go to trial but resulted in no conviction, you might find some records there. But for the most part, those records are pretty few and far between. For the attempted train robbery at 5 Mile Curve, there were federal records that were obtained from Philadelphia, National Archives, which came into handy. Transcript no longer for that survives because, back then, they really didn't save court transcripts. So really, I would say there wasn't too many, official records and documents to go off of. But from what there was in terms of, description from the newspapers and such, it certainly provided enough info to be able to do that. And, additional research that I've done as a genealogist helped me to track out additional records as well.
So as you were reading some of the old newspaper accounts, what did you find about how the newspapers covered these types of events?
So in regards to how the newspapers covered the events, here in Erie, it was very unique. You had the Erie Daily Times, which was always certainly going to be more open and sensationalistic than compared to, let's say, for example, the Erie Dispatch Herald. There were cases that the Dispatch had where they would write about it for several weeks and then they would just focus on other stories in the Erie area, whereas you would have the Erie Daily Times focus on stories for weeks and weeks on end. So there was a very clear different perspective between departments.
Now, in some of these stories, it seems like the crime scenes became spectator events. People seem to find them almost as part of their social entertainment.
Yeah, that certainly was prevalent, I would say. And it really, like I said, you could have a conversation going on and on about all these different cases and the impact that it had certainly on the public. With the murder of Manley Keene, for example, 1909, the fact that the crime scene was essentially still bloodstained up to weeks afterwards. People would go on trips, visit this location. And even, some of these areas would go on to be example of, local hauntings, and well into the 1950s and 60s, where these stories that were so grotesque certainly had that much of an impact, I would say, on the public. And it certainly kind of plays into that aspect that, as gruesome as some of these stories can be, the public will always kind of gravitate towards being interested in something that is really associated with murder and mayhem. And I think one of my professors has said it best: if it bleeds, it leads. Murder and mayhem sells. So these cases were certainly examples of that.
Do you have a favorite story in this book?
I would say, out of all the different cases that we write about in this book, probably the one, I wouldn't say favorite, but the one that I found the most interesting was the case of the Blackwood Potato Patch murder and the murder of Anthony Sporandio, which occurred during Prohibition. And the reason for that was that Erie during the 1920s was said to have been, pretty much comparable to counterparts in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Buffalo. In the effect that the only thing that was dry in Erie would have been the inside of a light bulb. That's pretty much prevalent if you read any kind of information from the 1920s about Erie's Prohibition history. But that really was one of, I would say, the more gruesome and fascinating murders, because it was a case where it involved Erie's Italian community, known as Little Italy. And what I was most fascinated about by that one was, especially, for example, if you read about current crimes that occur in certain communities, especially here in Erie, we see it, from time to time, is that police will mention that, well, so-and-so witnesses, aren't cooperating, or people aren't saying anything. And, with today's society and how everything is going, you'll see people, make comments that are, pretty much, I would say, racially motivated. They won't come out and say it, but, it is pretty straightforward that they kind of point fingers to a certain, demographic. And what a lot of people forget is, especially back in the 1920s, especially if you had like Erie's Little Italy community, not a lot of people came forward with a lot of information. There were people who were scared. And ultimately, at least from what I uncovered, the police had a pretty good idea of who committed those crimes. They had a pretty good idea who was involved. And it really was an example that, once again, we're, at least with that case, we're about, 100 or so years afterwards, but we still share the same kind of parallels with today's society as back then. But that one was interesting because I grew up on the east side here in Erie, and where the Potato Patch murder happened, I had walked past that location numerous times as a kid. And, it really was one of those things that as time progresses, as, the landscape here and around the world changes, you're taken back in time to a place that no longer exists, and it really gives you a different perspective.
So let's talk more about that case. Who found the body in the potato patch?
So with that, the body was discovered actually by two farmers who were heading to the market that morning. They were walking down Zimmerman, what would be today's Zimmerman Road, spotted blood stains that were in the roadway. They followed that to the potato patch nearby and found burnt out remnants of what appeared to be an unknown male that was partially burned from at least the waist up. And that one was pretty gruesome because at the time, a lot of people, and this also is another, again, time and time again, when you read these stories, these parallels with today's society come up. And it really kind of brings to a comment somebody mentioned, well, back then things like that didn't happen because those were the good old days. And I kind of, there was a little bit of hogwash on that, because what had happened is when that murder occurred, within a few days, photographs actually not only took photographs of the crime scene, but they were plastered on the front pages. So when I hear that argument about the good old days, I kind of disregard that because crime has always been around. It's always been front and foremost, available to us through any kind of media. It's just more widespread now because of social media, everybody having phones and electronic access. But that really was a case where it really kind of showed, especially during Prohibition, just the extent of, again, the sensationalist nature of the newspapers to deliver to the readers, about gruesome events that occurred.
Now, this is another case that Detective Frank Watson was involved in. Were there extensive clues at the scene? How did they proceed in the case?
With that case, that was one of the cases that he was indeed brought on to an extent because the district attorney's office was involved. The only evidence that they really found was a blood-encrusted Boilermaker's hammer, which was found near where the body was found. You had bloodstains in the roadway that were leading to the body, and there was some evidence that had been found on the body that indicated to the police that robbery was not a motive. I mean, the individual was definitely not wealthy by any means. There were also witnesses in the area the night that the murder, police believe the murder occurred. And some of the descriptions of a unique touring car led them to who was eventually developed as the prime suspect in that case. But you had numerous, I would say, evidence that had occurred with that. Again, you kind of go back to the fact that, we're talking about an era where it was all purely circumstantial. In today's world, that case, likely would have been solved. There would have been, a wealth of forensic evidence that would have been available to police. There was also a water bottle that was found nearby that was actually also found along with a piece of sumac tree that had actually been burned. And what police believed is that the individual, once he was bludgeoned over the head with the Boilermaker hammer, dragged into the field and set on fire, that when either the murderer or one of the perpetrators who assisted in that crime tried to take a branch and stir the flames up to try to destroy as much evidence and in the process possibly burn themselves. So, and the one thing that we also need to keep in mind is we're also going based off of evidence that the police released. Back then, as open as they were with reporters and the public, police still held back certain things of evidence. And that was indicated somewhat in the newspaper articles as well, as that they had additional circumstantial evidence. And at the time, it was just up to the district attorney to be able to prosecute it.
Now, there was another case that you write about, the murder of Manley Keene, and one of the figures that shows up in that case is a very famous private detective, Mary Holland. Who is she?
So Mary Holland at the time in 1909 was referred to as being essentially the female Sherlock Holmes. She had worked with Alphonse Bertillon in France. She had assisted cases with the help of Scotland Yard. She worked with the Chicago Police Department, and she was well known for traveling the country and championing, Bertillon departments that at the time were viewed as cutting edge and groundbreaking in terms of criminal investigations. So when this occurred in 1909, Mary Holland was very well known. She was well written about. She was well regarded in a lot of police circles. There were numerous instances and cases where she was involved in, where she received the utmost cooperation from different police departments, and she was respected in a time where women were not really given as much credit as they should have been. This is certainly around before the time of the suffrage movement. So, for her to essentially rise to the ranks in the law enforcement community at the time, working with these different jurisdictions, she was a really well-known, well-respected female detective. However, as readers will find out, once she came to Erie, there was a different power struggle that had occurred with local law enforcement jurisdictions, of course. But at the time, when she was brought to Erie to help work with the case, courtesy of the Erie Daily Times, it was really revealed as a groundbreaking moment for here at Erie, because it was not really something that the city was used to or had expected. But for the most part, she was a real powerful character that was kind of thrust into a situation which, again, really remains one of Erie's more bizarre unsolved murders.
So was she brought in by the newspaper itself? Was it some kind of stunt?
It was viewed, I'm trying to think here. It was viewed by the Erie Dispatch as being a stunt, just because the Erie Dispatch was one of the main competitors with the Erie Daily Times. The Erie Daily Times had actually paid for Holland to come, and they brought her on to the investigation because they felt that the investigation was being stymied to the point that the police were not doing anything. And by bringing Holland onto the case, the Times had hoped that, it would not only be able to shed some light on a murder, which had concerned the city, but really kind of lay waste to the issues that were going on in the department at the time. As I had stated previous, this was also a time where, in this case, is perfect evidence of it, where certain departments didn't really cooperate. And after Holland was brought onto the case, it really kind of highlighted the issues in the Erie City Police Department and, where they were inadequate in terms of criminal investigations. In a sense, you could say it was a stunt, but in the end, it worked out because from that point on, Erie City Police Department was actually provided with information that helped them, at least for the time being, improve their methods for criminal investigations.
Now, since she was brought in by a newspaper, did you find articles that they were regularly writing about her and her activities?
Yes, absolutely. So, as I stated before, the Erie Daily Times wrote about the Keene murder almost daily. And it was ironic because the Erie Dispatch, once Mary Holland was brought into the case, they didn't write about her at all because obviously their competitor had, done this what they call publicity stunt. So what had happened was not only was Mary Holland brought onto the case in that extent, but she also wrote articles for the Times, updating the public as to what she was able to reveal, what leads she was working on, and where she saw the investigation. And this included the fact that Mary Holland really didn't, I would say, she stood up to criticism very well. And whenever there was issues that she saw fit, she approached it and, confronted it head on. It was pretty apparent when the Erie County coroner had not done an autopsy on Manley Keene's body, something that Mary Holland was simply aghast at. And, it created an uproar within the city. And, that was, again, it's another example of, how our local history kind of changed, because after that, especially with the state legislature here in Pennsylvania, autopsies were almost a given after that, after some state laws were passed.
How did Manley Keene's family respond to Mary Holland coming into the case?
At first, Keene's family was very cooperative, including that of his cousins, John and Albert Kelso, where the crime scene occurred and the individuals who were last on the scene Keene alive. I would say that after she had come aboard the case, of course, you had this sensationalist nature from the public. You had people visiting the crime scene, which was essentially still private property belonging to Keene's cousins. So after a while, I would say they kind of soured at the idea, not only that, but the investigation as a whole, and eventually obtained an attorney. Forbid people, when this all occurred, it was also fascinating. People were just roaming onto the Kelso farms as they're looking themselves for any kind of information they could find, any kind of evidence. And after a while, the family eventually shut themselves off to the reporters, including Mary Holland. And it kind of leaves a lot to be desired, to the extent as to, what they provided. I know that at first, when Mary Holland arrived, she was allowed full access from the family, at least from the Kelso families, to the area, looking up evidence. But as the time progressed, she eventually received the same treatment as the police, that the family did not want to be bothered unless something absolutely certain would bring Keene's murderer to justice.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're a genealogist. How did you get involved in that?
So genealogy has always been a fascination on my side. On my father's side, my ancestors came over from Poland, and it really was something that I would say well over, 10, 15 years ago, I started getting into, doing research, eventually even traveling to Europe and doing extensive research there with Polish, Russian, Latin, German records. So being able to do that, build up, I would say, a record of, genealogy experience, was something that I always found fascinating. And this worked in perfect with this because, there are some records and relationships, and being able to find out with some of these stories what happened to certain individuals once they disappeared from the front pages also kind of helped aid me in my investigation and being able to write about these cases.
Now, one of the stories you tell is of the murder of Detective Sergeant James Higgins. Who was he?
So James Higgins was the first Erie City police officer killed in the line of duty, and he was murdered in front of what used to be Central High School, which was then located downtown on Sassafras Street. And Higgins's murder was really one of the first times that the city of Erie and the police department was faced with an enormous manhunt looking for a murderer who had murdered one of their own. And Higgins was a well-respected police officer and investigator. In fact, Higgins's personality was such that when prisoners at the Erie County Prison had heard that Higgins was murdered, they requested that they also be allowed to help search for the killer. Now, whether that's kind of romanticized or so on and so forth can be left open for debate. But Higgins was well respected from numerous individuals. And again, that brings in the first time, that, at least in the book, that you're introduced to County Detective Frank Watkins, who viewed Higgins as a friend and fellow law enforcement officer who he had worked on. Higgins had also been involved in several other cases that had occurred here in Erie. Was well respected within the department. He originally was born in New York, and his death really kind of shocked the community, and was that first moment for the city to kind of experience not only like a manhunt of that type, but really the effect that it also exposed Higgins's family to. We're talking about a time before there was any life insurance policies, and essentially when a police officer died in the line of duty, the spouse really did not have much, and the city of Erie really stepped up and supported Higgins's widow and his family. So it really kind of speaks to the mentality and the personality of Detective Higgins and the legacy that he had left when he was murdered.
Now, you quote an Erie Dispatch headline that says, "Red-haired men must watch out." As they were doing this manhunt, were they singling out red-haired men?
Yeah, specifically they were. Before Higgins died, he did give at least as much as he could with the extent of the wounds that he had sustained. He gave a basic description that the individual who murdered him was a young white male, red hair. And, at least the way that the book describes it, it really didn't seem like too much to go on. But again, we're talking about a time where individuals like, County Detective Frank Watson were well enamored and familiar with Erie's underground criminals. And at the time, what happened is most of the men who were primarily stopped is those who were matching the description of young white male, early in the mid-20s, red hair, chestnut-colored hair, if you want to say. And, essentially, the way that the articles describe all the way from Dunkirk, New York, even all the way down to Newcastle, Pennsylvania, you had additional police departments that would wire and communicate with the Erie City Police Department and say, well, so-and-so committed a crime here. He matches the description of Higgins's murder. And, essentially it is an example of profiling, but they were also going based off of what Higgins was able to describe before he died.
Now, you also write in the book about the conflicts between unions and businesses and how that often led to explosions and other criminal activity. What did you discover there?
So with that case that had occurred at the Pennsylvania coal dock that occurred in 1911, that was really a fascinating situation because at the time, this is when the country was dealing with the rising power of unions. And what had happened at the time when that explosion occurred is there were numerous explosions that had occurred throughout the country, especially in this area, New York, Pennsylvania, and especially in Ohio, where there was specifically, you had railroad bridges, infrastructure that was tied to shipping and transportation that were specifically targeted. And the culmination of that and the possible connection, to the explosion of the Los Angeles, I believe it was the Examiner building, really kind of showcased, the veracity of union officials at the time, where, there was just this open warfare against the general public. And, you had hundreds of individuals who died from some such instances. Luckily here at Erie, the only damage was to the property itself. There was no injuries or nobody was killed, luckily. But it really kind of showed, again, into perspective, you're dealing with a world that doesn't exist as it does today. And even back then, it was still potentially dangerous. And Erie had a history with, dealing with issues with unions and different kind of factions. And it was really a fascinating case. Not only that, but to really, again, to kind of hit on different types of law enforcement agencies that were involved. That one was a little bit more difficult because we really don't have too much information about it. Nobody was ever brought forth and prosecuted for it. But the information, at least that was outlined towards the end of the chapter, really kind of designated who they felt was likely responsible. And all the evidence and everything circumstantially certainly amounts to that the unions were involved with that explosion to that extent.
Now, what we're looking at there is the explosion of a coal trestle on a dock. So, I mean, how big was it, and did it collapse the entire trestle?
It didn't collapse the entire trestle. Only portions of the trestle were damaged, but the explosion was such that some of the steel girders actually were thrown into the air, and almost actually, had they, I believe the way the article described, had they been several feet off or any closer to one of the ships that was more nearby, it probably would have hit the ship and probably would have killed the crew. There is extensive damage to the coal trestle itself. It didn't demolish it or anything, but eventually, I believe they did rebuild that portion of it. It wasn't really, I would say, a terrific explosion to where it would have completely, dismantled everything for sure. I mean, it was a pretty, I would say, large explosion for the most part, but it didn't really dismantle anything. But there was still obviously sufficient enough damage that rendered the services at the ore doctor inoperable for the time being.
What types of explosives were used?
I believe with that one they used nitroglycerin. So you had, some of these explosions that would have occurred with the nitroglycerin, different types of explosives. I believe the explosives that they actually had traced for that, they had, determined that it was not any explosives that were used here, for any kind of dredging or anything like that. It was something that was brought from out of town. And, they were able to determine that based off of the types of explosives that were used, like, for example, in coal mines and everything that were probably down south by Pittsburgh. But there was the part of the chapter that goes into discussing the type of explosive that they believe was responsible and what it looked like. And they were able to find examples of, they were able to actually uncover evidence after the explosion as to how it was set up, the fuse that was used, how much time, the attackers would have been given to flee. So that way they, were able to get away in time so nobody could see them.
What do you like about true crime? Why are you drawn to it?
So I think what draws me most to true crime, especially, is the angle of everybody loves a good mystery. Everybody loves to be able to hear about a story and think, well, what can I look into that nobody else has thought of? Or, what can I bring to this type of story that brings a unique spin to it? And, that was really kind of evident, at least with this book, because we're dealing with cases that, again, nobody alive today knows really about most of these. Probably the only case that I wrote about that the public was probably aware of is the murder of Higgins, because we have a memorial downtown, with his name inscribed on it. But beyond that, it was, something that, my interest in true crime being able to look at, different stories and mysteries and see what else we can add to it that was not known back then, what evidence we can uncover today, which is probably minimal compared to what we have available, really brought a lot of these cases again to the forefront for the first time in over 100 years. And, at least what fascinates me with true crime was being able to do that with a local history spin to it.
Talk a little bit more about the local history. How did you become interested in local history?
Well, I was born and raised here my entire life. Ever since I was young, I've always been fascinated with history. And, for me, being able to be downtown, being through different parts of the city, hearing about stories, not just about true crime, but Erie history itself, ever since the city, was founded long before that, being able to stand in those places and envision what happened back then. Again, being able to go back to a time, where things did or didn't exist, or the different perspectives that occurred. So, as I've gotten older, it's definitely something I've, become more appreciative of. And it's something I've always just found endlessly fascinating, just learning more about the city, because every single day it's like anymore, you can really find things that, it always keeps you on your toes, and it's something new every day that not only myself, but there's hundreds and hundreds, thousands of others who live in this area who are just as fascinated by it, who offer, different perspectives and stories. And it's something that keeps me wanting to learn more.
What do you hope people take away from this book?
Well, first and foremost, I hope that what people take away from it is that just because you're dealing with crimes and stories that are really gruesome and graphic in nature, that people were still essentially affected by it. You still had individuals who never received justice who have been forgotten, and those individuals deserve to be remembered. The legacy they left behind, the families and heartbreak they left behind, like I said, some which are still felt even today. I believe there was a niece of Detective Higgins who had mentioned that she was looking forward to reading the book. And I know that from past newspaper articles with their family, when he was, received a award from the Erie City Police Department, that family sustained a lot of heartbreak after Higgins was murdered. You had also a relative of Police Chief Detzel, who was also featured prominently in the book. Members of his family reached out and advised that they are looking forward to reading it. And I hope that what people can take away is, again, just because these stories happened over 100 years or so ago, doesn't mean that the impact isn't still felt today. The impact that hasn't changed the community, is still prevalent there today. For example, again, going back to the Erie City Police Department, how they do investigations. A lot of the stuff that spearheaded them where they are today with how they handle crimes happened back around the time of the Manley Keene murder, when Mary Holland came in and, the department had to be revitalized because of flaws with how they investigated and approached crimes. And, first and foremost, that true crime is essentially local history. A lot of books these days don't focus on it, but it is true. True crime is local history, and the impact that it does have on a city can, be instrumental. It can be minor, it can be major, but it's definitely something that should continue to be studied for years to come.
And we've been talking about the book Murder and Mayhem in Erie, Pennsylvania. Justin Dombrowski, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.